Hello. I want to discuss today, instead of focusing on the weekly Parsha, I want to talk about something that is a timely halachic question related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And specifically, I want to focus on the question of what bracha we should make, or what prayers we should say on the occasion of receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. And may we all very soon have the opportunity to do so. In an email earlier this week, that I sent out to the community, I had responded to a question about from someone who asked me what prayers or blessings they could say on the occasion of the inauguration of a new president. And in that context, I discussed the laws of the blessing Hatov V'Hamitiv, which is recited on the arrival of good news, and specifically good news which benefits the person saying the blessing as well as others. And on the question of the presidential inauguration, I explained that blessing is only said by someone who directly benefits from the event in question. The Talmud brings the example of a farmer saying this blessing after the arrival of rain, but not someone who doesn't have a field or a farm. And so in the case of the election or inauguration, even if someone was very happy about the news, they wouldn't say the blessing in its entirety. However, they could say this blessing without the formal blessing formula. And so instead of saying Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, they would just say Baruch Hatov V'Hamitiv if they were feeling about any news which positively impacted them and others, which they felt happy and joyous about and wanted to acknowledge God for. But when it comes to COVID, the COVID vaccine, the question is a somewhat different one, because as the vaccine becomes more and more available, and many members of our community, thank God, are able to access it, those who are either highly at higher risk or are working in healthcare, but otherwise or in any other way, in a high priority category. Those people who are receiving the vaccine are receiving a direct benefit from the vaccine because their likelihood of becoming ill due to COVID-19 is going down dramatically. Not to zero, but it's going down by 95%. And now, at this point, it's unclear whether the vaccine significantly reduces the likelihood of the person spreading the virus, which would be of clear benefit to others besides themselves. But even if it turns out that it doesn't reduce the risk of transmission and only reduces the risk of becoming ill, it still has the indirect benefit to those who are not receiving it, that we all now live in a community where fewer people are going to become seriously ill and fewer people are going to die as a result of the COVID pandemic than would have had the vaccine not been available. And that put less strain on the healthcare system and is of benefit to all of us. So for this reason, a number of poskim, including my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Dov Linzer, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Chovei Torah, have ruled that one may recite the blessing, Baruch Hatov V'Hamitiv, in its entirety, including saying God's name and saying Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, on receiving the first dose of the vaccine. and someone who's hearing this or read this after receiving the first dose and didn't make a bracha on receiving the first dose could make the bracha on receiving the second dose instead. But you only make this bracha one time, either way, preferably on the first dose, but it could be done on the second. Now, in addition to the blessing of Hatov HaMeitiv, there are other prayers which are appropriate for the occasion of receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. The Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim Siman Reish Lamed 230 subsection 4 states, Hanichnas lahakiz dam omer יהי רצון מלבנך השם אלוקי שיהא עסק זה לי לרפואה כי רופא חינם אתה. So one who goes to have bloodlet, which was a standard medical procedure in the time of the Shulchan Aruch and for many, many centuries, that person should say the following prayer. May it be your will, Hashem, my God, that this matter be for my healing, for you heal freely. And then after the bloodletting, they should recite Baruch Rofei Cholim. Blessed is the healer of the sick. Nowadays, of course, bloodletting is no longer a standard medical practice, as it was in the time of the Talmud when this blessing is first recorded through the days of the Shulchan Aruch. However, that prayer can be recited for any medical procedure or treatment, although there's disagreement about what types of procedures merit saying the blessing afterwards, Baruch Rofei Cholim, as a full bracha, with some arguing that we can say that blessing with God's name and mentioning kingship, with a normal formula for a blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, followed by Rofei Cholim, for any medical procedure, and others saying we would only say that blessing, that blessing after a medical procedure that involved risk. So bloodletting being the example, you're afraid they're going to hit a major artery and the person could, God forbid, bleed out. Or according to some commentators in the time of the Gemara, they really drained a lot of blood at once, and there was a serious risk to that procedure. So the analogy would only be to those medical procedures nowadays that involve some significant degree of risk. But regardless, the prayer beforehand, the Hi Ratzon, it's not a formal bracha. And so this could be recited before any medical procedure, and a number of poskim have written that we can and should say this before receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. Now you might have thought, well, it's not, even though it's not a treatment for a disease, a vaccine is a procedure to help prevent you getting a disease in the first place. Nonetheless, that maybe that would be in a different category, but nonetheless, a number of rabbis, including Rav Linzer and including Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon, have written that this blessing should be recited before the vaccine. Now, unlike Hatov HaMeitiv, which is recited after receiving the first dose and can only be recited once, this prayer, this Yehi Ratzon, should be recited prior to receiving the vaccine, and it should be recited prior to each of the two doses, as it would be prior to any medical treatment. So I encourage folks to who don't already have the practice of saying this to make this a practice of saying this blessing prior to going in for any minor medical procedure, and all the more so major ones. And there's another blessing which we might think about saying for the COVID-19 vaccine, which is what's called Birkat Gomel, or we say colloquially benching Gomel. So this is a blessing which is, according to the Talmud, is recited on occasion of someone who recovers from an illness, or who travels through the wilderness or by sea, or someone who has been released from prison. And it is generally it is recited in synagogue with a minyan, because it's a blessing to publicize that our salvation doesn't just happen, that it comes from God. And in practice, many have the practice nowadays to say this not just on the specific situations mentioned in the Talmud or early authorities, but anytime we survive a dangerous situation, such as a car accident or a mugging or a terrorist attack. And while someone who is ill with COVID and recovered, all poskim, all authorities would agree that person should bench Gomel, should recite Gomel, because that's clearly in the category of someone recovering from an illness. It's one of the explicitly named categories in the Talmud. There's a question about whether to recite it if you never got sick from COVID, but you did receive the vaccine. And some poskim are reluctant to suggest reciting Gomel after receiving the second dose of the vaccine, either because, as a general rule, they limit Gomel to the cases explicitly mentioned in the Talmud, or because they don't consider that the risk of contracting COVID-19 is enough of a danger to say that getting the vaccine is saving us from a dangerous situation. And Rav Linzer was in that category, although even he acknowledged that for people who are in high-risk professions, he mentions medical personnel, but you could easily add anyone working in a retail or a food service environment, that those people are at higher risk of contracting the illness, and certainly even according to someone like Rav Linzer, we might speculate that he would even allow in those situations to bench Gomel. Although, but I'm not convinced that we aren't all in enough of a dangerous situation. The Talmud's examples are traveling through the desert or traveling by sea. Now, my sense is that I don't know what the mortality rates of traveling through the desert are, but my guess is that your likelihood, people, if you took the subset of people who traveled through the desert this year, and who died as a result of traveling through the desert for accidents, thirst, getting lost, etc., and then looked at the entire population and how many of them died from COVID-19, my guess, I could be wrong, that we're going to see COVID-19 is we're all at more risk of danger from COVID-19 than people who travel through the desert are at risk of traveling through the desert. Now, maybe I'll leave it to the statisticians to actually sort out the details on that. But it seems reasonable to me to suggest that we're all at least as much risk from COVID as someone walking through the desert is of walking through the desert. Of serious injury or mishap for walking through the desert. And so, it's my humble opinion, and this is, take that for what it's worth, that those who, that anyone receiving the second dose of a vaccine is at enough risk to merit saying that getting the vaccine could merits saving them from a serious, dangerous situation, and they should bench Gomel. Now, unlike the bracha of the Hatov HaMeitiv or the prayer before medical treatment, Birkas HaGomel is said with a minyan in order to make our expression of gratitude public. And accordingly, someone who receives the vaccine should wait and bench Gomel the next time they come to shul after receiving the second dose of the vaccine. The custom is for men to bench Gomel after they receive an aliyah. However, you can say the bracha anytime there's a minyan present. So And now in some communities, women don't bench gomel, but it's certainly permissible and laudable for a woman to do so. And anyone who's unable to come to shul and is not going to be able to do so for some time could say it without reciting God's name. And this bracha is found in any siddur. So I was going to leave things there, but I actually had the chance to speak to my friend and my colleague, Rabbi Hershey Novak, while I was preparing this message, and he shared a novel idea he had with me about what a person might say upon receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. Without getting into his thoughts about any of the other brachas I've mentioned, which he might or might not agree with, he said there's a bracha he pointed out that there's a bracha our sages instituted on seeing an outstanding secular scholar, someone who's learned in a field other than Torah. And we say that bracha when we see such a person to express our recognition that ultimately all wisdom, all intelligence, all learning comes from God and is a credit to the Creator more than the person who is who was blessed with that intelligence and that wisdom. And the bracha begins in the manner of all bracha: "Blessed are you, Hashem our God, King of the universe," and concludes, "Who has given of His wisdom to flesh and blood. Shenatan mechochmaso levasar badam." And while we can't really say that the vaccine is an exceptional scholar, it is the product of miraculous human accomplishment in the area of science and medicine and ingenuity. This vaccine is actually the fastest vaccine that's ever been created, beating the world record of all vaccines previously made up until this point. And certainly, if we met the scientists who made this vaccine, one could argue we should make that bracha. So even though we're not going to say the full bracha on the vaccine, Rabbi Novak suggested to me that it might be appropriate upon receiving the vaccine not to say the whole bracha, but just to say the phrase Baruch Shenatan Mechochmaso Levasar Vadam. Blessed, without saying the part God's name or mentioning His kingship, without saying the formula that makes it into a formal bracha, just simply saying, blessed is the one who gave of His wisdom to flesh and blood, acknowledging that the ingenuity and the intelligence and the knowledge and the creativity that made this vaccine possible all came from the Holy One, blessed be He. Lastly, while rabbis and scholars may disagree about the applicability of any and all of these brachot that I've discussed, and the halachic value of not taking God's name in vain might lead, and generally leads us to be conservative about whether we say a doubtful bracha. And so some people, even though there are poskim saying that these brachot we can say, some of the ones I mentioned above, there might be people who would be reluctant to do so. Nonetheless, reading Psalms is always appropriate. So someone who receives the COVID-19 vaccine might choose to read a psalm afterwards, and I would argue should choose to read a psalm afterwards at the very least. And Rav Rimon, in his article, and this suggests Psalm 100, Mizmor LeTodah, a psalm for thanksgiving, which would be a very appropriate sentiment for the occasion. So I had prepared in the written version of this message, which you can find on the Base Aid website, I prepared a printable version of some of the prayers and blessings I recommend reciting on receiving the COVID-19 vaccine, which I've discussed up until now. And I prepared that with some humility and trepidation, recognizing not everyone agrees that these blessings should be said, but everything that I have recommended that involves saying God's name was something that was was recommended and approved by scholars greater than myself, even if others might disagree with them. I also omitted Hagomel from that list, not because I think it's not appropriate, but because it's a blessing that's ought to be said in synagogue rather than in the waiting room of the doctor's office. I hope that in discussing the halachas of which brachot might be appropriate and which might not be, or when to say them, we don't lose sight of the fact that the purpose of reciting all of these prayers and brachot is to give expression to the awe we should be feeling at participating in what is no less than a modern medical miracle, and the gratitude we should be feeling for the safety it affords to those of us who are able to receive it. And whatever blessings we do or do not recite, we should be prepared to receive the vaccine, as we should all medical treatments, aware that ultimately health and sickness are in the hands of our Creator, and that the best doctors and nurses and the most advanced medical technologies in the world can only heal when God wills it. And I think all of these brachot all brachot ultimately are there to remind us at occasions when we might be feeling awe, or we might be feeling gratitude, or we might be feeling inspiration or appreciation, that ultimately that gratitude, that awe, that inspiration, that appreciation ultimately should be directed towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the creator of all things. May we swiftly see the day when the COVID-19 vaccine is available to all, and in addition, that when reliable and effective therapies to treat COVID-19 are developed and available. And until that moment comes, may Hashem place a spirit of cooperation and of selflessness in the hearts of all people in this land and throughout the world, so that we will take the steps necessary to protect one another from the spread of this infection long enough for those vaccines to be available and those treatments to be developed. Shabbat Shalom.